Hello, and thanks for watching us for the Farmacy Cannabis Lecture Series. Each episode brings you a small, in-depth dose of cannabis education. My name is Candace Hawes, and I want to thank everyone for watching today with us, and especially our customers from the Pharmacy Santa Ana, Santa Barbara, Berkeley, and the Pottery in LA for joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking about Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome, also referred to often as CHS, which is an uncommon but serious condition found in a small portion of regular long-term cannabis users. CHS was only first formally described by researchers in 2004 and is not still widely known about. Cases of CHS are on the rise, but it still isn't clear how some heavy cannabis users can get the syndrome, but others don't. At the Farmacy Cannabis Lecture Series, we think it's important to cover all aspects of cannabis usage and research, from the benefits and the good parts of cannabis. Also, it's important to talk about the side effects and the potential consequences. So I'm really happy to have Dr. Codi Peterson, Pharm.D, here with us today for a presentation on what researchers know about CHS and what you can do to treat and prevent it. I want to tell you a little bit about our guest speaker before we get started. Codi Peterson, Pharm.D, MS, is the Cannigma's Chief Science Officer. He's also been a practicing pharmacist with a passion for cannabis-based medicine. Given his diverse pediatric pharmacy experience and knack for educating, he tries to share his knowledge whenever possible, and I would agree with that. Building on his experience teaching healthcare professionals about pharmacology and pharmacotherapy, he aims to educate as many as possible about the medical potential benefits of cannabis. I'm excited to have Dr. Peterson here with us today to talk about Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome. Now, thank you so much for being with us today, Codi.
Woo! You know, it's really hard for me to enter these webinars and not talk in those first, like I'm a chatterbox, right? So like I always feel like I'm holding my tongue. I want to chime in like 3 times, but really excited to be here, Candace. I was so excited when you asked me to be on here, and then you were listing off the names of the individuals who've also been featured on this show, and I am beyond flattered. So really excited to share what I know and what I see in my practice. And to be honest, that includes Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome. So can't wait to get into it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And first of all, was I saying it correctly? Because I know people said it different ways.
Considering the fact that I'm now looking at the presentation I sent you and I spelled it wrong right off the bat on the first slide, this is not a good start. However, it is hyperemesis or hyperemesis. It's really a matter of kind of speaking, right? These words are derived from Greek. So if you've ever heard it's all Greek to me, well, this is actually derived from Greek. So it's kind of just a pronunciation thing and not a big deal. And I am really embarrassed about that E on the front page. I'm my spell checker caught this twice in my presentation, but missed it on the front page.
No worries. I know how busy you are, being a practicing pharmacist and working with the Cannigma. So I really appreciate you making this happen and putting this together for us.
Super excited. And like I said, I am indeed a pediatric pharmacist, and I do see cannabinoid hyperemesis sometimes. So without further ado, do you want to get into it?
Yes, please.
Let's talk about it. Okay. So thank you so much. I appreciate everyone for coming and joining us live. If you're catching this on the YouTube afterwards, thank you again for spending the next 45 minutes with me as we discuss this really important topic that unfortunately has been far too stigmatized. The truth of the matter is cannabinoid hyperemesis is happening. And I know this because I see these individuals in the hospital that I work in. And the truth is a lot of them are even unaware that this is such a thing. So as you know, I'm Dr. Codi Peterson, a pediatric pharmacist, cannabis science expert. And I'm here to tell you cannabis is medicine. Cannabis is undeniable utility as medicine, and it can help millions of people. But no medicine is without side effects. I know this from pharmacy school. I also know it from life. And there's a little bit of logic too. Even too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. So where do we start? Right? This is a complex disorder, and we're going to get into how complicated and why, what makes it difficult. But we have to start with how cannabis works. And in order to understand how cannabis works, we need to understand the endocannabinoid system. Now, I might say cannabinoid, I might say cannabinoid. Once again, this one's not Greek, but that's not really the point. The point is these are pronunciations of the same thing, and we know what we're talking about. Now, no matter how you say it, this is still a master regulator of homeostasis. What the heck is homeostasis? This is a term for balance in life, in organisms that exist here on life. And the endocannabinoid system has been expressed or explained in these 5 words. It's important for relaxing, eating, sleeping, forgetting, and protecting. And by forgetting, I mean forgetting traumatic things. It's sort of sifting through your memories, remembering the important things and forgetting about the unimportant things. When I say protect, I'm talking about your whole immune system. And when I say eat, it's very important to this conversation. Now, why is there a crocodile in the background? That's because it's not just you that the endocannabinoid system does this for. No, in fact, all animals on Earth, right? Every animal with a spine on planet Earth has an endocannabinoid system that is critical to how it functions and moves every day. And it's the body and life using the fats in our diet and producing them into molecules to, once again, create balance. Why do I keep saying that? Well, when we create balance in the body, we get really important things like gut motility and appetite. So how do you know when you eat? How does your body naturally know, generally speaking, when to stop eating? And why, when you smoke weed, do you not stop eating? And so this is because of the endocannabinoid system. Another great example is your neurocognition. Why do we get high in the first place? It's not because THC is magic. It's because THC is a plant that speaks the same language as our brain. THC has sort of found itself to mimic our natural endocannabinoids that are produced within our body. This is an endogenous system, meaning everything that we need for the ECS to be healthy should be in us, as long as we're eating right and we have the correct genetic profile. Cannabis is an outside supplement. We don't need it. The ECS thrives without it, and it thrives in all animals on Earth. But when we consume THC, we activate this system. In particular, we activate two receptors, proteins in the body and brain. These receptors are called CB1 and CB2. You can see in this beautiful infographic by Cayman Chemical that these receptors are everywhere. Again, CB1 being the most densely located receptor in your brain. So you've heard of serotonin, you've heard of dopamine, but CB1, there's more of those than dopamine and serotonin. That's because it's so critical to maintaining balance amongst all the other systems. Additionally, CB2, you'll see all through here, has a lot of functions in preventing inflammation and the immune system, okay? Some other cool things that we want to talk about that are pertinent to CHS, we'll get there, is body temperature. The endocannabinoid system regulates body temperature. So when we give THC to rodents, to mice, if we give a large enough dose, they will actually pass away because their core body temperature drops below what they can actually sustain life, okay? So the ECS is critical to temperature. We'll get there. And metabolism, how your body decides to burn fats and use fats. And that is sort of, again, metabolism with food. Keep that in mind. Appetite and gut motility. Once again, am I hungry? Okay, I'm not hungry anymore. Kind of helping regulate these signals is the ECS, regulating hormones and neurotransmitters and all sorts of things. Kind of looking at this system, you'll notice that if you think back to what you learned in biology, there's supposed to be 11 body systems. The nervous system, which you can see is in the blue at the top. But the heart, the vascular system, is a totally different system. Notice how the ECS is in both. And that's because the endocannabinoid system is not a body system. It is a cellular communication system. And in so, it is all over sort of the web in between all the other systems, keeping it together. Now that you understand the ECS, or at least you have a good baseline understanding, let's talk about cannabis as medicine. So this plant evolved to make this psychoactive molecule THC, but it's not there for humans to consume. Cannabis evolved 20 million years ago in the central plains of Asia, and humans evolved somewhere around 500,000 years ago in Africa, much, much longer after cannabis was likely making THC. But we can use these cannabinoids as medicine because of the endocannabinoid system that we share with all animals, including the ones that originally were in the native habitat of cannabis. Now, cannabis is not just one thing. It is a plant, right? It's not just THC, although we have bred it and grown it to be very, very rich in this molecule. It also contains CBD, other terpenes, which obviously are all the rage right now for all of my cannabis folks. But there are also minor cannabinoids. It's a bit of a misnomer, but other cannabinoids in cannabis that have effects. And then, of course, there's the cannabinoid acids, which are the natural way the cannabis plant makes THC. The cannabis plant produces THCA, and it must be decarboxylated either by smoking or by heating. So these all of these molecules swirl together to make the medicine that is cannabis. And, it's reasonable to think, if we're talking about cannabinoid hyperemesis, that one of these, the most abundant things in cannabis, are responsible. Now, cannabis as medicine? Well, cannabis is medicine, and I'm not just telling you my opinion, I'm telling you the FDA's opinion. I'm telling you that all of these drugs in front of you, including the one on the left, which is a synthetically derived but perfectly identical delta-9 THC molecule, Marinol and Syndrose, are exactly the same thing that you get upon the plant producing THCA and decarboxylating it. Now, the product in the middle, Epidiolex, is plant-derived CBD. That is actually from cannabis plants. It's essentially a disti, and it's mixed into 100 milligram per mil product, and that's used for pediatric epilepsy disorders. And on the right, we have a synthetic cannabinoid developed thanks to the beauty of THC and what it helped us discover, that whole system that we talked about. And it has been it has been also approved for multiple reasons by the FDA. Most importantly, you'll read on the sides, both of these medicines, THC and nabilone, CB1 agonists, have been approved to treat chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, which obviously is a big theme of the talk that we're having here. So I just really wanted to highlight that these are medicine for nausea. And so what the heck is going on with cannabinoid hyperemesis? Well, cannabinoid hyperemesis is not what you would think. In fact, it's a bit paradoxical. We think of cannabinoids as being antiemetic, but in this case, long-term cannabis users seem to develop a specific set of symptoms that suggest that they're not tolerating cannabis very well, and it's not helping their nausea. This CHS, Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome, is characterized by intractable vomiting. It means retching. It means we can't seem to, it's incessant. We're not feeling good at any point. And this can last for hours or days, sometimes described as scromiting on the internet, screaming and vomiting, because patients are so uncomfortable. The pain is so intense. And I've seen numerous patients say they just want to die. Often this recurs or reoccurs cyclically, so every couple weeks or months, and an increasing intensity, at least if we continue to consume cannabis. Refractory to most nausea medications. I see these patients in the emergency department. The doctors, frequently they're bounce back patients. We'll get there in a moment. But what we see is our typical medicines, which is usually ondansetron or Zofran, they really just don't touch these patients, and it doesn't get them where they need to be. And if we're not suspecting cannabis use, often that's really where we start. And we start looking in some very obscure places, even with cameras up from the up top or bottom, to figure out what's going on, especially if we don't know that there's cannabis use involved. Additionally, we do have CHS is subcategorized under a very similar condition called cyclic vomiting syndrome, which can be really kind of difficult to distinguish. We'll get to that in a moment. How common is cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome is a big question, and I'm going to shoot you straight. We just don't know, Candace, and everyone else listening. We don't know. Here's what I can tell you. It is not uncommon for me to see 1 or 2 of these patients a week in the hospital in Southern California, a small little blip. And so we're not really, this isn't rare by the standard definitions. Rare is only 200 people in the country have it, and certainly we know that it's higher than that. Originally thought to be rare, cases are increasingly frequent. I've even seen an increase in the last few years in the emergency department that I use, although I don't have any statistics to back that up, just my personal experience. So estimates from the literature that I found there were some really high estimates, probably a little high, said that 33% of regular cannabis users, regular meaning daily, had some of these nausea-like symptoms, so either prodrome CHS, which we're going to get to in a second, or actual hyperemesis. And that would suggest over 2 to even 3 million Americans are dealing with this symptom or the syndrome, and that feels a little high to me. Now, the low estimates suggested, just as a baseline population, that this would be the risk, the average American. So looking at that, it suggests that only 1 million Americans could be dealing with it, and it could be even fewer, depending on how many people would report their cannabis use. So somewhere between probably 750,000 to 3 million Americans might be struggling with this issue. And the interesting thing is many people don't even realize that they have cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. Now, the reason is a lot of people don't know, they haven't heard of it. And that's why we're having this webinar right now, but also why it's so important that we can feel comfortable talking about it. And that's going to be a theme that comes up throughout this talk, is we just need to have conversations. No medicine is perfect. Cannabis is darn close to, and it can be used for so many good things, but we have to be willing to accept side effects. Now, looking and comparing cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is the focus of today's talk, to cyclic vomiting syndrome, you can see some themes that are kind of similar. But one big differentiating factor is CVS, cyclic vomiting syndrome, usually happens as a child before a patient ever tries cannabis for the first time. Now, that is not a rule. That is just a generality. As opposed to cannabinoid hyperemesis, as you might expect, only develops after a patient has started using cannabis with typically some regularity. Now, CVS, cyclic vomiting syndrome, is really common to be associated with migraines. Now, CHS can sort of cause some headaches and be associated, but typically these patients don't seem to have a history of migraines, whereas CHS patients do tend to report for quite a long time some sort of miscellaneous or idiopathic, not sure what's going on in my tummy for a long time. Many patients come back to the hospital a couple times a year reporting issues, and it's never really put together. Now, cyclic vomiting is often relieved by THC. So now we're really blurring the lines between cyclic vomiting and cannabinoid hyperemesis, because CVS patients respond well to THC versus CHS patients are usually dependent on THC or using it very regularly. But we know that it's not just THC, by the way, because we have seen this vomiting disorder with synthetic cannabinoids like the one mentioned earlier, the pharmaceutical one, and also some ones that were never approved for human use. So just to point out that it's not strictly THC, there is a cannabinoid component to this. Now, frequently misdiagnosis. Cannabinoid hyperemesis is missed all the time because why? Patients don't tell their doctors that they're using cannabis. Doctors usually don't even know what the endocannabinoid system is because it was discovered only in 1992, 94. So many doctors weren't educated on it. And lastly, a lot of patients, a lot of doctors just aren't aware of the diagnosis itself, or there's just a communication gap. So cyclic vomiting is commonly misdiagnosed as CHS. So now I have cyclic vomiting patients who have THC in their urine and they're having a cycle of vomiting, and the doctor's suspicious that this is cannabinoid hyperemesis. So this is going both ways, and it's really kind of frustrating. Now, here's one of the primary distinguishing factors. It's a pathological finding in cannabinoid hyperemesis. Somewhere around 80% of patients find relief from their nausea by taking hot baths, showers, etc. So this is something that is not reported with cyclic vomiting. It's certainly not in nearly the same percentage. And so this is one of the ways that has been proposed to even help distinguish between these two disease states, or syndromes, you could say. Now, 3 phases to cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. It will always go in this cycle, right? That's part of it's a cyclic vomiting disorder. Okay, so the prodrome phase is where people will be most of the time. If you are a chronic cannabis user and you are in the prodrome phase, usually you're using daily or even more frequent. You're using every day. Now, the data says at least 1 time a week is a risk factor. We'll get to that in a minute. But you're probably using cannabis daily. Now, and you're often dealing with something that's pretty mild: low-level nausea, heartburn, food intolerance, appetite changes. It's generally not a big problem. Some diarrhea, we'll get there. And so it's not something that you profoundly associate with cannabis. This is sort of an underlying issue. And oftentimes patients feel that cannabis helps them with food intolerance and this low-level nausea, right? So it's not uncommon for patients to continue using cannabis, almost feeling that it helps. Now, patients often also report anxiety, restlessness, malaise, or being tired, just feeling unwell overall. Now, the thing that makes cannabinoid hyperemesis disorder is the hyperemetic phase. Hyper meaning a lot, and emetic meaning to vomit. So a lot of vomiting phase. And this is a period of intense bouts of vomiting, which can last hours, but usually days, and average about 48 hours. And weeks sometimes. Some patients can deal with 2 weeks of vomiting. This nausea is resistant to standard antiemetics like we discussed, but interestingly, it does seem to respond to antipsychotics. Again, we'll get to treatment later. Commonly relieved by hot bathing, as we discussed. So patients who are dealing with this find themselves spending hours in the bath trying to feel better. And patients will spend time in hot baths, both in the prodrome and in the hyperemetic phase. Now, the recovery phase is where we want to be. And this is a period of symptom-free time. So when you're not feeling nauseous, not feeling that heartburn or not. This is really common for patients after, let's say, they go through a bout of emesis. They can't tolerate any food or even any weed for a few days. Maybe they're admitted to the hospital and they seem to start to recover. And unfortunately, for a lot of patients, cannabis cessation, stopping cannabis, seems to be the only way to truly end the symptoms. Now, a lot of times, patients will try even a low dose, and it'll start the whole cycle. That is not a hard and fast rule, though. I want everyone to know, and I guess maybe I didn't preface this well enough, is this: we don't know enough about all of this. Everything that I'm talking about is we really are just under-informed, but this is as best as we know. This is the cycle, and then again, ending on that, cannabis cessation seems to be the best way to handle it. Don't worry, for my folks who are that makes anxious, we will get there, okay? All right, how do you know if you have it? This isn't an easy question, right? Cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome is a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning that a doctor has to exclude other conditions, right? Is there something majorly wrong with you? Is there an ulcer? Is there something wrong in the bowel themselves? Do I need to get an image of the intestines? So it's really difficult. So we see this underdiagnosis because patients aren't honest about their cannabis use and it's difficult to identify. And we see an overdiagnosis in those patients that with cyclic vomiting syndrome who happen to also use THC. They're kind of camped in there with the CHS patients. So we have kind of a mixed overshot or skewed lines here. Additionally, nausea is not directly following cannabis consumption. Now, some individuals get nauseous as soon as they smoke some herb. Or as, a couple hours into an edible, the room is spinning and they're feeling unwell. That is not cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. That is being sensitive to the effects of THC. We know at low doses, THC has this antiemetic effect, but at really high doses, it seems to have this sort of pro-emetic effect. And if you're taking a THC-only product at a dose maybe you're a little not used to, that can happen. Or maybe you're just super sensitive. You have a lot of CB1 receptors and you're just really, really sensitive to THC. That's also fine, but that's not cannabinoid hyperemesis. This is really a syndrome associated with the chronic consumption, the weekly consumption over long periods, because it is inherently an endocannabinoid system dysfunction. We've sort of set it out of balance. So cannabis use in CHS is chronic, high dose, very regular, and typically inhalation. There's statistics around how often. I don't want to get into the weeds around what people are using and how frequently. Most people know if they're a pretty chronic user, and you can take it from there. But this means at least weekly, if not multiple times a day. The Hallmark symptoms, we've already talked about it. Long-term THC, repeated bouts of intense nausea and vomiting, particularly if you haven't stopped THC. If they continue after stopping, that's a different conversation. And the majority of patients get relief from hot baths, somewhere around 4 out of 5 patients. A lot of patients, in my personal experience at the hospital, deal with a lot of lightheadedness. So they're kind of struggling between getting in the hot shower and bath and feeling better and feeling like they're going to be sick or fall over. So it's really not a good feeling to be in the midst of one of these bouts. Now, what are the symptoms of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome? I've kind of touched on a lot of these already, but I want to kind of go line by line. Nausea in the prodrome is very, very common, and it's worse in the morning. Everyone reports this all over the Facebook groups. This is a known thing. And my, I guess, hypothesis is that we know the endocannabinoid system is more active in the morning. And since this is a syndrome of essentially endocannabinoid dysfunction, or at least that's what most of the evidence suggests, that's sort of my theory. But regardless of my theory, that is a very common symptom. appetite problems, feeling like you can only eat if you have cannabis, or even worse, even cannabis isn't helping and you just can't seem to tolerate food. A lot of patients feel like they get the food stuck in their throat or in their stomach. Diarrhea is another common symptom. So not what you would expect. If you're not being able to eat, you get diarrhea, but definitely it's associated. And remember, the ECS is all through the stomach, the esophagus, the small bowel, the large intestine, the colon. It's all over the place. Heartburning, gas, and bloating, really, really common symptom that people do not associate. So many of the kiddos that I see that get diagnosed with this are often started on PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, to help with acid production, because they are experiencing this GI regurg, but it's really not associated with too much acid. It's associated with their cannabis use. Now, once things transition to the hyperemetic phase, and it's not clear what cycles someone into the hyperemetic phase, it could be increased use. It doesn't have to be. It could be something they ate. Yes, we'll get there too. It could be some sort of stress trigger. And honestly, the endocannabinoid system is so intricate and interconnected. It's even tied to a woman's menstrual cycle. And there have been reports about a woman who dealt with menstrual-related CHS. And it would wax and wane around her cycle. And this makes sense that since we know that estrogen has a direct effect on the endocannabinoid system. It's also why women experience cannabis a little bit differently than men, maybe have edibles experiences that are a little more profound. And you can learn more about this on my Instagram. Go check it out after the talk. So if we're in the hyperemetic phase, regardless of what got us there, we're dealing with intense bouts of nausea and vomiting. This is uncontrollable. Like I mentioned, scromiting. A lot of patients are getting relief from hot baths in this phase, but severe abdominal pain, often starting in the upper stomach, and this inability to tolerate food. Now, I'm not talking about appetite problems. I'm talking about like you can't hold anything down, any drink, any food comes, you immediately upchuck. And we're talking about for days, if not weeks sometimes. What are your risk factors? These are things basically, well, some out of your control, some in your control, right? Your age, less than 45. You cannot control how old you are. We just know the vast majority of patients who have developed CHS are less than 45. But go figure, the vast majority of heavy cannabis users are also less than 45. Albeit not all. Not all by any means. And certainly as time goes on in this legalized world, we're going to get more and more individuals over that age who are regular users. I know I'm rapidly approaching. So the another risk factor is, we already talked about it, regular type 1 cannabis use. What is type 1 cannabis? It's marijuana or high THC cannabis, okay? So using this regularly, at least once a week, but that's really the abnormal case. Almost always daily, and usually multiple times a day. Living in a legal state seems to be a risk factor. Could this be a bias? Could this be like around, who's reporting, yes, I consume cannabis? Or is this maybe have to do with the availability of concentrates and this increased THC? We don't know. It just appears that there's more cases in legal states. Another third option could be doctors in legal states are more in the know around the side effects of cannabis and kind of expect it more. And again, that's going to create less or more diagnosis, not less. So long-term THC users seem to be at risk too. So it's not uncommon for patients to be consuming for greater than 5 years before developing or recognizing the syndrome. And it's also frequently not seen before a year. It can happen. Some individuals really just don't tolerate cannabis well, or maybe are more disposed, but definitely there is this chronic nature to the use. So it's frequent and it's long-term chronic. So what causes CHS? I know you're itching to know, Candace, and the truth is I don't know. So my primary leading hypothesis, this is my personal opinion, the science has not come to consensus on this, is ECS dysregulation from chronic THC exposure. Now, why someone doesn't get that, but other people do, right? That's the next factor, which we know is involved, and we're going to get to in just a second. Genetics. What is going on with our genetics that drives this response to THC? And then lastly is the conversation around, and I guess it's not lastly, second to lastly, is the pesticide conversation, talking about particularly neem oil. And this is what a lot of individuals feel is contributing to this syndrome. primarily driving some of these side effects. And the answer in those individuals' eyes is typically, cleaning up the cannabis industry, making sure there's no pesticides and we're truly growing a clean organic product. Lastly, there's this idea of maybe allergies. This is just a developed intolerance to THC, and that's possible, but it doesn't really present like the typical allergy. I might call this in the hospital, if we were documenting allergies, an intolerance. But a true allergy is typically mediated through the histamine system, and that doesn't appear to be what's going on here, as patients don't get a lot of relief from antihistamines.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to know how complex this order is, you're going to have to read the paper by Devuno, who wrote this in 2020, that kind of put together this really big picture that I wanted you to see. So let's just start at the top. Excessive cannabis use, maybe I wouldn't use the excessive cannabis, but regular chronic cannabis use, high doses of THC can lead to ECS dysregulation. Now, how does this lead to nausea and vomiting is the question. And if you kind of follow the arrows, you'll notice they're going both ways. Remember, this is a master regulatory system, and we don't know what exactly is causing it. But a couple highlight points, and I can do some drawings on here that Candace showed me, so I'm going to try to be fancy. Please, everyone, just wait for me while I figure it out. So here I want to highlight, here's your ECS dysfunction, right? And I talked about how important the endocannabinoid system is. So regularly exposing any system to any drug, this is opioids, this is anything, will lead to tolerance. So the same reason chronic users can't really get high anymore, certainly not as high as they used to, is because the same reason that they are at risk of developing CHS, because the same system that's in your brain is also throughout the rest of your body, and it can also become desensitized. Now, there's a couple really important systems here that I want to highlight. The first one is called the HPA axis. See that? That is the hypopituitary axis, hypopituitary adrenal axis, and it is involved in your stress response and your hormone production. So that's the estrogen connection we made. And it's also the cortisol. If you think about stress and how bad it is for us, the endocannabinoid system is part of our defense system against that. And when we chronically expose the system to, let's say, THC, especially at high doses, without supporting it in other ways, we'll get there, we can have this dysregulation. Now, the other thing that is super important, and we're just pointing to these here, is this genetic predisposition. Now, the genetic predispositions are in the next slide, but this is a really critical factor. This is essentially why Snoop Dogg has been able to consume as much cannabis as humanly imaginable and still not develop this nausea disorder. While unfortunately, some individuals will only use cannabis for 6 months and not even be regular habitual smokers, and they will develop it. Why? Well, we don't know exactly, but we know lots of these things are involved. And then there's actually another receptor involved here, the TRPV1. Wow, that's a big bubble. This is the capsaicin receptor, the hot chili pepper receptor, and we'll get to why that's important. Okay. Last thing is over here on the right, you can see that hypothermia was listed, right? And inhibited GI motility. These are really important factors as well when we're thinking and contextualizing why THC is causing CHS. Now, here's what Ethan Russo found. Yes, Ethan Russo, the man who wrote Taming THC, the man who sort of paved the way around the entire entourage effect that you, the listener, probably knows about. Ethan Russo did a survey, and he did a survey in conjunction with genetic tests. There it is. It was published just there in 2022 in the Journal of Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research. And here's what he found. He found statistical associations between cannabinoid hyperemesis and these 5 genetic markers, okay? So these are the dots in front of you. Now, the first 2 are CYP. It's really the genetic codes, by the way, that encode for these proteins or enzymes. So these enzymes, the CYP 2C19 and 2C9, these enzymes are responsible for metabolizing THC in our body. So anyone who knows about why edibles hit harder and knows about edible THC consumption, they know 11-hydroxy makes you get higher, right? THC hits harder when you take it by mouth. More for women sometimes too, as I mentioned. This is through the CYP system. And these alterations in CYP could be contributing to a production of metabolites that leads to CHS, okay? So they found statistical associations between patients who have CHS and these 2 hepatic metabolites. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
All right, cool. Now, the next, well, we're going to jump on the right now. Now we're going to come over here to dopamine on the side. DRD2. That's dopamine receptor, dopamine 2. So there's many different types of dopamine receptors. And dopamine is that feel-good molecule that you've heard of. But it's also really important for our heart function and our kidney function and so much more. Now, dopamine is metabolized and produced in the body. The green COMT, this circle right here, this is actually an enzyme that is involved in metabolizing dopamine. So we see that. And over here, DRD2 is an enzyme involved in the actual receptor by which dopamine acts on. So we see a clear connection between these individuals who are dealing with CHS, their metabolism of cannabinoids, and maybe their metabolism and innate underlying dopamine systems. And then lastly, in the middle, we have TRPV1, which is one of my favorites. This is the capsaicin receptor, the chili pepper receptor. This is the exact reason that chili oil makes your mouth feel hot. And you have these TRPV1 proteins all over the body. They're forming technically ion channels to help calcium or potassium flow freely in and out of cells. And these TRPV1 receptors appear to be involved and are also technically part of this greater endocannabinoid system that I'm always ranting on about. So these are the connections that Ethan Russo made between looking at patients who have CHS and looking at their genetic code. Okay, so there's clearly some alterations. There's some criticism of Dr. Ethan Russo's study, and maybe even some self-criticisms. It's simply that he didn't get enough individuals involved. He ran into some PR issues, but really that we need more data. But this is awesome stuff right here from 2022, and it really shines a light on why, Willie Nelson is 90 and can still toke, but unfortunately some 17-year-olds have developed a syndrome where they can't. So could pesticides be to blame? Look, I'm going to just shoot you straight. Maybe, but none of the experts in the medical field feel this way. And frankly, there's no existing evidence to suggest it's true. So if I'm just going to tell you. Neem oil is a long-used natural pesticide. It's extracted from the seeds of a neem tree, which is technically a tree that can grow in the subcontinent of Asia, and it's really kind of grows like a weed. They extract this oil from the seeds, and that oil has pesticide activity, right? It repels pests. So, and it is true that neem oil is generally untested for in legal cannabis labs because it's not historically been a big pesticide. And I'm not saying every lab, it certainly can be tested for, but that's true. But at this time, there's no real connection between neem toxicity and CHS. So for starters, this has never been found. There's no, not even a single case report saying, oh yes, somebody was smoking specifically, tainted cannabis and it came out. Now there's plenty of reports amongst cannabis users and in the community of that happening. But the same is also true of the story where someone who develops CHS and they only smoke their home grow and they know there's no neem. There's examples where there are patients who were previously buying dispensary weed and went to home grow after developing CHS with no avail and with an inability to return. So that sort of rules it out. But more than that, let's just look at the actual evidence, the anecdote aside. Neem toxicity has been reported in patients, children who drink neem oil, people who are exposed to maybe like aerosolized inside of tents, inside of like a grow house, for example. And what we see is vomiting right there. That's it. But that's going to be acute vomiting. This is a large dose of neem, many, many, many times more than you would get from your cannabis flower. And you didn't just see vomiting. You saw hepatic toxicity. So that's liver toxicity. Something called metabolic acidosis, changes in our pH, showing stress on the kidneys, and encephalopathy or brain swelling. This is a high dose of neem that does this. Clearly, we're not dealing with that because we have seen none of those three things in our CHS patients. We have seen some problems with their metabolic panels, but it seems to be related to dehydration from vomiting so much. Mm-hmm. Now, when we look at chronic exposure, so let's imagine this is probably more in the talk that we're having, we see again some very generalized overlap, some muscle weakness, easy fatigability, right? So, and some hypotension, I talked about that earlier, headache maybe, but we really don't see confusion. We really don't see these symptoms presenting as this sort of overall tiredness because we have a clear recovery phase. Once we stop consuming cannabis, the vast majority of patients will go into this recovery phase and then jump right back into a nausea and vomiting shortly after they reconsume. So it doesn't seem to fit the picture. It really just doesn't explain this cycle. And so, like I said, individuals have tried their own cannabis they know isn't neem contaminated and still have developed CHS, as well as we have case reports of patients on synthetic cannabinoids, be it Nabilone, the prescription, or those bought from like a head shop or, you know, an illegal place, which have no reason to be contaminated with either neem nor pesticide. And they still develop cannabinoid hyperemesis, suggesting it's not pesticide, but rather your endocannabinoid system, your CB1 and CB2 and many other receptors that are dysfunctioning. I know you're wondering how to treat it. Actually, probably not. This is the pharmacist in me. I could not put this slideshow together without telling you how this goes down. I just wanted to touch on it briefly. But like, cannabinoid hyperemesis is not an emergency until we get into a dangerous point where we're dehydrated. So like, you know, the first bout, it doesn't need to be something you run in for because there really is very little treatment we can do. But I want to be very clear with this. It can be dangerous. And we're going to get to that in just the next slide. But managing a simple bout of CHS at home is reasonable. You need to recognize, though, when this is becoming intolerable. Multiple days of no eating or drinking, unable to keep food down is not normal, and it puts you at risk of serious consequences. It may seem like you're fine, but dehydration can sneak up on you. And again, give me one more slide and you'll appreciate why this matters. What's going to happen if we try to treat you in the hospital? Remember, this is my bread and butter. I work in a pediatric emergency department. I see patients with this disorder and use these medicines to help treat them. Are they good options? They're not. You'll notice that none of them are very good. The first medication is hot chili oil. Remember how I talked about that receptor involved? Well, guess what? We found out that if we rub capsaicin, which is a medicine developed for arthritis on our hands, if we rub capsaicin on our belly and on our back and maybe the back of our arms, we can, sort of distract the patient with some burning, but also there appears to be a clear change in the way the patient is feeling from a nausea perspective. So we can get burning. It seems to help with nausea, but it kind of has diminishing returns. And the other thing is that I want to point out is this is actually mimicking the hot bath approach. So this is us using a chemical from chilies, capsaicin, to actually sort of trick the body into thinking it's warm, and that quells the nausea. It's pretty cool, right?
Yeah, that's very, very interesting.
Yeah. And even cooler is the capsaicin. The chili oil does this through your endocannabinoid system, not CB1 or CB2, but through that TRPV1 receptor that I talked about.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. I got so excited when I learned this. Zofran on Dancitron is the drug that I dispense all day long in the hospital. It can be given oral or IV. It helps with nausea and vomiting, but it's generally not effective for CHS. We have a bunch of other medicines in the yellow there that we can try. Most of them don't have much benefit and certainly very good, no good research. Now, lastly, the drug that we do have some emerging research on are these two medications, Haloperidol and Droparadol. These are old medicines, probably from the 1950s or older, and they're really antipsychotics in their nature. And they're working better than any other options. They have a really, let's say, use-limiting side effect profile where they can have serious adverse effects if used regularly. So they're not the solution to this problem. Can it help get us out of a danger period where we're unable to tolerate anything? Sure. But leaning on these medications is not a recipe for success in combating CHS. And we won't go into too many more serious side effects there, but they can range as bad as, developing diabetes or even gaining 20 or 30 pounds. So deaths from cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. Yeah, that's what I said, and I mean it. So here's a case report from 2019 where 3 cases were reported on. Now, if you're paying attention, you will hear over and over and over that cannabis has never killed anyone. And that is technically kind of true. The direct dose of THC, because of this wonderful way that THC acts on the CB receptor, it's a partial agonist, and the wonderful location of the endocannabinoid system, not in the breathing center of our brains, we can't actually overdose on THC, not humans anyway. We talked about rodents earlier. When this happens, people just get really sleepy, but you can't sort of tip over the edge and pass away from THC. But I hate to be the bubble burster or I guess maybe the semantics person in the room. Cannabis has contributed to the death of numerous individuals, whether that's a car accident, but maybe more literally this case. So cannabis or chronic cannabis use associated with CHS was responsible for at least 2 out of the 3 deaths reported in 2019 in this peer-reviewed journal. Now, no, there was no one distinct cause. It was from causes secondary to cannabinoid hyperemesis, which is a combination of low blood sugar, low sodium, and kidney failure from dehydration. So those things swirled together to lead to the death. And these individuals were vomiting for anywhere between 7 and 14 days, oftentimes going to the hospital, being seen, and then being sent home just a handful of days later, only to develop worsening symptoms and regrettably pass away. So the next time you hear cannabis has never killed someone, there's like an asterisk next to that that thing. Now, cannabis is a tremendous medicine, a tremendously safe medicine, herb, supplement, adult use, recreational product, whatever we want to call it. Because let's just conceptualize that. I just told you cannabis killed 2 individuals, secondary to the misuse of it. Cigarettes kill 7 million people a year globally. I just want to frame that for people. So this is sad, and I certainly feel terrible, and it doesn't reflect perfectly on cannabis, but this is the conversation we need to be having. If we want the other side to come to the room, we need to have the honest, sincere conversation about the pros and the cons of cannabis. And then we need to frame it in the adult conversation around what else we totally accept.
Yeah.
So strategies, Candace, like people want to know, like most commonly when I counsel patients in the emergency department, like they really want to know what they do next. Like, where do we go from here? Because I've been using cannabis for quite a while, right? Maybe years, maybe 10 years, et cetera. And it's really helped me for X, Y, and Z. And I believe that individual wholly. It has helped me. It has helped my family members. It has helped my patients. Cannabis is miraculous, but it's not without side effects, and that's what we need to do. So if you develop CHS, here's some 5 helpful tips, and we got to start at the bottom, y'all. I hate to tell you, you got to stop consuming cannabis, particularly high THC cannabis. We know that this is the inciting factor, regardless of whether it's neem, regardless of what the genetic factors are. That doesn't matter. If you've developed CHS, you need to stop consuming THC. Maybe we can get back there. We'll talk about it in 1 or 2 more slides, okay? Now, when you stop consuming cannabis, life is going to get harder because you've become accustomed to using cannabis. So we need to support our endocannabinoid system. Historically, you've been doing that with THC or with CBD or whatever cannabinoid mixtures you're using. So you still need to do that. How are you going to do that? You're going to do it in surprisingly simple ways, Candace, ways that I don't have directly listed on here, but you're going to laugh when I start talking about them, right? You should spend time with your friends, not using cannabis. You should get out into nature. You should listen to music you enjoy. You should exercise. You should do meditation. You can try yoga. You can read for pleasure if you like that. Like, this isn't fancy stuff. You got to take care of you. And that you is the ECS. Remember, it's all over you. So that's sort of your support your ECS through your through your behavior. Stop using cannabis. You got to get adequate sleep. This is going to be difficult in the early phases of stopping THC. In the first week to 3 weeks after stopping, it can be extremely difficult for a regular THC user to sleep, but it's important. So you need to start setting aside more time. You need to consider your valerian root. You've leaned on one plant for sleep for a long time. No point in avoiding another one. We need to focus on supporting your sleep habits, because there's nothing that will heal your brain and help your endocannabinoid system come back better than sleep. Now, a couple more things. You need to avoid trigger foods. Now, I don't want to say need. I say you should consider avoiding is what I'd like to say. What the heck is a trigger food? It's on the next slide. It's talked about in the CHS community, but it is not published in the literature. Nothing about it in the literature. So I want everyone to know that this is anecdote, and I'm really trying to bring everybody the full perspective on an issue that is not well studied. Now, last thing after avoiding your food and drink, we need to support your endocannabinoid system through community. Like I said, meet with your friends, sure. Find a group. Find a therapist. Find a church, a local cleanup crew, the local raptor society because you're super into birds of prey. Whatever it is that you like to do, find your friends, because we know being with people and having a shared goal is cannabimimetic. It helps us craft this system that is so important. And I really can't encourage it enough. Now, I talked to you about trigger foods and strategies. Now I want to tell you how to sort of deal with it. So these are ways to support the last slide is strategies to develop for those who develop CHS. This is the same idea, but a bit more concise. Abstinence is your only treatment. I'm sorry, it's the only evidence-based treatment. We don't have anything else at this time to suggest, and we also don't have anything to suggest it's a pesticide and you can just switch cannabis products or switch from smoking to edibles, etc. Another thing I've read on the internet through the Facebook groups and talking to patients is that it helps with baths are helping you. But like maybe, don't kill the planet, waste all the water, whatever. Maybe you're falling over because you're getting lightheaded, all of those things. Think about a heating pad. It plugs right into the wall. The only thing you need to be worried about is falling asleep and maybe having a burn. We trust adults with candles. I think we can trust them with heating pads as well. Expect morning nausea. This is not something that might happen. It pretty much happens to almost all patients who develop, at least in the early phase. And if you develop healthy morning habits in place of cannabis use, because a lot of these patients have leaned on cannabis when they wake up to help them with their nausea, you can go a long way. And avoid caffeine in the morning as well. You don't have to. Maybe you can try a low caffeine option, but caffeine is one of those triggers. I want you to be mindful when eating and make note of any foods that trigger cannabinoid hyperemesis syndromes. Anything that's making you feel unwell should be placed in a bin to not partake in now, right? Once we're through this next phase, then we can consider it. Let's talk about those trigger foods real quick, and then we're going to talk about your plan. I'm going to give you some tools to try to enter this. If you develop CHS or someone do some steps to follow, I suppose. Trigger foods are, like I said, this is not evidence-based. We don't have science here. But they're basically based on things that we know will either activate the endocannabinoid system or release endocannabinoids. So it's also based a little bit on people's perception. I just really want to get across that this is not based on the literature. You can see it was developed by a Facebook group, CHS Recovery. Now, this is based on reports, but everyone responds differently. So what bothers one person won't bother another. But if you look at the major trigger foods, these are not a surprise. Alcohol is almost always listed and reported as problematic. And here's what I can tell you as someone who has a good understanding of alcohol and cannabis. One, if you put them together, THC gets to higher amounts in the brain. That sounds like a trigger to me. But if you're not together, and let's just say you're just taking alcohol and because you've abstained from cannabis after developing CHS, alcohol can actually trigger the release of anandamide, your own endocannabinoid. Right? That's actually one of the reasons it feels so good. And because of that, it can induce this episode, okay? Now, episodes are typically from food or typically not the full-on episode from THC because these are not potent cannabinoids. But that's kind of the premise. The same thing with white pepper, black pepper, truffle, cacao. All of this is around endocannabinoid systems and really everything listed here. Now, here's what I will say. This is a lot of healthy stuff. Okay, so I don't want patients to be like, oh, I don't want any of the good stuff. Maybe you can cut off caffeine and alcohol, but the rest of everything on this list is quite healthy. So I don't want patients to say, just throw all these out. I want them to be, when they consume these foods, to mindfully consume them and see if it upsets them or not, okay? So once we get out of that sort of 90-day period, which we're going to talk about in the same thing, we really should support the use of fresh herbs and omega-3 fatty acids. But during this acute recovery phase, it may be best to steer clear. The number one question asked to me by my patients, hands down, is this, I can never consume again? And this is a hard question to answer. One, because I'm talking to usually a child or someone who's 16 to 18 years old. But in addition to that, the truth is this is pretty much what we know works. If you want me to say, here's the treatment that will make you better, this is it. Now, CHS is a spectrum disorder. It's not like you have it or you don't, or it's not like you fit the character and you vomit every 2 days at 12 noon and that's your cycle. It just occurs on a spectrum, and it has to do with your stress levels. It has to do with your hormone levels. It has to do because it's your endocannabinoid system. Yeah. So some people may be able to go back to using cannabis. They let's say they deny that's not the right word. They don't think they have developed CHS. They go back to trying to consume cannabis. They're good for a week. It's probably going to remit though. Okay, let's say you stop for 3 months and you go back to using the same dose of cannabis you were using before. You're at pretty high risk of relapsing and sort of going back into CHS. So it's not unheard of that people like stop smoking, maybe go to edibles, do low dose, maybe go to herb instead of vape pens. Like there's been a lot of talk in the community, but none of them have been shown to be successful, certainly not with enough regularity to recommend. But there are some unproven strategies to mitigating the disease, reducing your chance of a flare, and that includes those trigger foods that we talked about. I wanted to give people strategies. I wanted to give people tools to walk away from this talk with. And I thought long and hard about this, and I counseled a patient just 3 or 4 days ago on this very topic. And, you know, it was sort of a standard course. He had an issue when he was 14. He saw the gastroenterologist. They started medicines for stomach acid. They went through this whole process. And I just happened to be working the night that he finally admitted to using THC. And when I got a chance to interview him, he revealed to me that he had been using regularly since essentially like a year before his symptoms began. So I started out with a heavy vape pen use, moved his way up to dabs, and had backed off to flower and really had felt like he was getting better. But here we are again. We just had another cycle. So it's kind of, I just want to give you this real world thing. This is not something I'm pulling out. This is not made up to be anti-cannabis. This is real, and patients are dealing with it. And it's okay. Take a deep breath. It's okay if you've developed CHS. Like, we have to stop making people feel bad, making them feel weird. We know this is a side effect. We know there's a genetic component, things out of our control. So take a deep breath. You can do this, okay? Cannabis can be addicting. It's mildly addicting, especially really THC. But we deal with much more difficult things day in and day out. We just become accustomed to needing cannabis. But the beauty of cannabis is, and this is from Dr. Dustin Sulak, he said, you know, you develop CHS and you can't quit because you're addicted to cannabis. He says, I've heard this from many patients. And he says, I respond to them, great, at least you're addicted to cannabis. Because there's so many worse things in the world. Yeah, and this is from him at CanMed, so I don't want to take Dustin's thunder there. But he was so right, because there's so many worse things like cigarettes and alcohol and opioids, and I can just keep going. And so, great, good. This is something that we can manage, right? So if you develop CHS, I hate to tell you, I'm going to tell you, if you come to me asking for advice, I don't have a recommendation to switch cannabinoids. We have to stop because we need the ECS to reset. We don't have a choice to sort of kind of flex it down and sort of only flex it 70% because we just we're not that in tune with the tone of our ACS. So you need to plan to abstain for about 3 months. That is not an exact timeline, but the reason it's set that way is because that's how long it takes for all these lingering things to get out of your body, especially if you have any excess body weight. After that time, during that time, you need to make sure you have social support. You need to join a group. You need to go talk to your friends. You find a friend that you can talk openly about. You should not have to face this alone. You are so far from alone, but it will support your ECS to talk about it and have a friend who's also dealt with this. So I highly support that. And we've already talked about how to support your ECS naturally. It's all the things you like doing already. Okay. Assess your response, right? So now after 3 to 6 months, you've quit using cannabis. Are you still vomiting? And is it still cyclical? And has it gotten a lot better? Has it only gotten a tiny bit better? If it hasn't gotten better in 3 to 6 months, congratulations, you don't have cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. It doesn't usually happen. Sometimes symptoms will linger for a year, but you'll pretty much know. Additionally, when you consider going back, if it comes back, then we pretty much have an idea, right? So if you assess your response and it's resolved, great. But if you have a diagnosis, right? Great, you found the problem. I can't tell you how to proceed though. Cannabinoid hyperemesis, we don't have a long-term data saying, oh yeah, you quit for this long and you're good to go back to your regular life. Unfortunately, it's not gonna work that way. But I didn't wanna leave you guys just there because that's where I feel many of my patients get left, whether at my hospital or a different hospital or wherever they find care. I don't wanna leave you with no tools, no hope. This cannabis is an amazing herb with so much utility. It can support us through so much. What can we consider doing to avoid this, to get better, to support our ECS? If you want to use cannabis, consider minor cannabinoids, CBG and cannabinoid acids, things that don't strongly stimulate the CB1 and CB2 receptor. And again, this is after your period of abstinence. We can utilize ratios. If you're going to use THC, take it with some CBD, and more than just a little CBD. Go 1-to-1, go 5-to-1. The CBD molecule tempers and puts a ceiling on the THC, and it may, we don't know this, it may help prevent CHS. And the reason we think that is because individuals aren't reporting this from these types of products. They're reporting it from high THC cannabis. Yeah. And then lastly, use the lowest effective dose. I know this is hard. Every product you pick up in the dispensary is infused. It's a whole gram joint, and frankly, most of us don't need a whole gram of infused cannabis. So use the lowest effective dose for your desired effect. Now, what's your desired effect? I challenge you to think about that the next time that you use cannabis. So this is the message I want to leave you with. And this has to end. No more stigma. No more telling patients that's fake. No more telling them it's their pesticides. It's their cannabis use. Even if it is the pesticides, it's their cannabis and they need to take a break from it, right? We can't just switch them over and expect them to get better when we know the inciting factor. I want to learn more, but we can't learn more if everyone is hiding and not wanting to share with their friends that they've developed this really unfortunate situation that is completely manageable, though. We are not in a situation. It really is. We can work through this. We can support your ECS. And I promise, we can at least get to a point to try cannabis again. But even if you can't go back to cannabis, you can support your ECS. And most of us can thrive without cannabis. And that is the beauty of the endocannabinoid system, our diet, our microbiome, and this magic of life made out of 40 trillion cells that you call your body. So I'm Codi Peterson. You can call me Dr. Codi or Codi, don't care. These are all the places you're going to find me, but that's less important. If you look on the right, these are useful resources for you if you're listening to this and you've developed CHS or you're worried you have. Here's some Facebook groups to check out. If you're not on Facebook, cool. Here's some Reddit. PTOs is about stopping cannabis, or mediating your consumption. CHS info is about everything CHS. And Lee's, if you want to be done with cannabis, this is a subreddit to help you just quit for good and know all the things that you can do and thrive by stopping. You'll find some really amazing stories there because cannabis is beautiful medicine and it's not without side effects. Lastly, if you're super interested in that DNA test, and I have no stake or share in any of this, Dr. Ethan Russo does have a website set up where people can take the same test that the patients in his group did. And you can see if maybe you have some of these genetic markers that line you up with cannabinoid hyperemesis.
That's really, really
I have no idea what time it is. So did I do good?
Yeah, this was so wonderful and so insightful. I mean, I think our audience learned a lot about the endocannabinoid system and about cannabinoids. And then I learned a lot of things about CHS that I didn't even know, and a lot of things that really resonated because I've talked to a lot of people that had it. There was one girl that said that, she seemed to have symptoms of CHS that persisted for a couple of days, but only when she drank alcohol and smoked together. So that was really interesting that you mentioned that. And through the chat, we have so many people, have learned something or things have resonated with them. So this has been wonderful. And if you still have time, we have a couple questions I'd like to ask you.
Yeah, I want to answer questions. That's why I'm here, is to help people.
Perfect. And I also wanted to put this link up here too. Can you talk just briefly about Cannigma and what resources they can find there? And then also,
I didn't even know to mention the Cannigma. Yes. Yeah. So the Cannigma is an amazing resource for all of your needs. We do have a couple articles on cannabinoid hyperemesis. It's we're talking to the whole cannabis space, and this is a small section, so we don't have too much on there. But the Cannigma is a wonderful resource for all your cannabis questions, whether you're looking for why it is that you feel shivery when you smoke cannabis, to answering the questions about how much cannabis you should use to infuse into your homemade edibles. All of these answers are available on the Cannigma, as well as some tools to help you figure it out, and just really some beautiful infographics we've made. So I think we gave you all a PDF handout who attended. One of my favorites that we put together, the chemistry of cannabis. You might have tell I'm kind of a nerd. And just everything that you could imagine. We have a wonderful cookbook. I hope that Candace shares with you the link to go download our cookbook. That would be amazing. And that'll also sign you up to get our emails and learn from me and also these amazing advisors that are on my team that really bring it the next level to the Cannigma, whereas a lot of the places when you Google a question around cannabis, you're not sure if you can trust the answer.
Yeah.
The Cannigma has peer review process where we're having a medical professional or a cultivation expert, culinary expert review these articles and make sure they're up to snuff. And I think that's sort of what we're bringing to the table. So I encourage all of you to check that out, and then would be happy to move on to questions.
Perfect. So one question was tolerance breaks. Now, would it be a good idea for people to institute tolerance breaks to help prevent possible CHS syndrome showing up in them?
I'm sorry, Candace, can you repeat the question one time?
Yeah, somebody was asking about should patients be taking tolerance breaks from cannabis, like maybe every year, take a month or a couple of weeks off to kind of reset their endocannabinoid system so they can like maintain lower levels to treat their medical condition?
Totally. Yeah, look, that would probably be a protective measure. I don't think it's warranted for the average patient as long as you don't feel your dose is escalating. And caveat is you're getting what you need, right? So a lot of individuals I come across, especially individuals who maybe been not worrying about putting the joint out halfway and just smoking that whole infused gram joint, right? Tolerance can build rather quickly. And so I've met individuals who, sort of want more out of their cannabis, and those individuals, they could really benefit from a tolerance break. But I don't want to say just generically they need tolerance breaks. But if, let's say, finances were a concern or there was a concern around CHS, there's plenty of good reasons to consider a tea break.
Very good. And I know that you mentioned this, but there was a couple people that just asked again, would using like lower percent THC be a better idea for people to try to avoid getting CHS?
So the pharmacist in me feels compelled to say that it really doesn't have to do with the percent of THC exactly. It does, but whenever I'm talking about medicine, I rarely mention the concentration unless I'm just trying to measure how much I want. I'm talking about dose, right? So regardless if I have 10% flour, if I have 10% flour, that's 100 milligrams per gram. If I have 30% flour, that's 300 milligrams per gram. If I smoke the same 1 gram joint, they look the same. One delivers a lot more THC than the other, and just that inherently is reducing it. So, but if you take that 10% weed and you put a 3 gram joint together, both contain 300 milligrams. And really, I couldn't say directly that 10% would be better. It really has more to do with dose and less to do with concentration or potency. So that's why dabs and vaporizers are not inherently a problem. They often linger in that space because they are more concentrated. It's very easy to get habituated. And in particular, around vape carts. Like I see this in this pediatric population. Vape carts are easy to hide. It's pretty common for teenagers to use them. And in that same vein, we see regular use. You wake up, you take a puff. You kind of stressed out at school, you take a puff in the break. All these factors that make vapes so convenient also make them, in my personal experience, there's no data on this, a little more likely to show up in this CHS picture. Not exclusively. Definitely not just dabs or just vape. No, all the types of THC, even edibles, and even sometimes CBD has been implicated in CHS. Although so few and far between, you sometimes wonder, was it really just CBD or whatnot? But for now, Cannabinoid Hyperemesis is named cannabinoid because it's certainly not just THC.
Very good. And I think you also mentioned this before, but somebody just asked again, that can they use different delivery methods, and does that help? If they smoked all the time, and they switched to like sublinguals, is that a better route? I think you mentioned that already, but if you could, talk about that.
I mean, these are mitigation strategies, and they're not wrong, right? Like we know that this is sort of a threshold disease. Like we don't know what that threshold is, but like there's definitely like a spectrum of severity, and so like reducing your overall dose by more mindfully consuming might help. But still, it comes down like when down to brass tacks, like we're talking about THC. So if you can reduce your dose, maybe. But I rather than switch dosage forms, I would recommend experimenting with minor cannabinoids or cannabinoid acids, and I think that those are better recommendations. But again, we don't have a lot of data on whether cannabinoid acids will induce a flare, right? There's quite possible. So I really want to be mindful of that. Is like the only known treatment, the only thing that you can do to actually stop these from happening is to abstain. And who can respond to what dose of THC, what route after? It's a reflection of you and your ECS. If you want to get back to that point, though, I can tell you assuredly, this is going to require all those things that we talked about to be healthy, right? We need to get into those things that we love. We need to exercise. We need to be mindful. And all of these things we already know are healthy. We need to go to a good concert every once in a while.
Love that. Another question here. I don't know if you can answer this or not, but what's the typical dose of Haldol that a pharmacist might give a patient to treat the symptoms of CHS?
Yeah, so the most commonly studied dose, it's been reported in the literature, is a 5 milligram dose of haloperidol. It's kind of a standard dose. Most of the time, the vial is a 5 milligram dose. It's given intravenously once. It has more success than any of the other medicines that we use. There's a conversation in our institution right now whether we should use it one time or maybe 2 or 3 times, like in a window, right? And unfortunately, there's just not enough safety there. The primary risks, like the big risks, the scary risks with Haldol, have to do with like the heart stopping. And so it's not a big concern in a healthy young individual heart who's got normal electrolytes, yada, yada. So, but these medications have serious side effects. There's no doubt. And so avoiding them is to our benefit. And additionally, especially haloperidol and these antipsychotic medications, if used regularly, can have like things that, we really don't want to get into, but like movement disorders that are permanent, all very significant side effects. Like I said, diabetes. So I think avoiding them when we can is judicious. Using them when we should is also judicious. So it's really, this falls a little bit on CHS patients being educated on what's going on, being given tools rather than just being told bad and no, and then left to your own devices. So we have a long way to go, but we are seeing progress. Things are being recognized, and we're working on research. I know that someone had asked me, it was you. It had asked me what research was going on with CHS. This was off air. I looked it up, and clinical trials in humans are really primarily right now focused on just sort of what treatments work best in the hospital. There's very little going on around the cause and sort of this underlying what's doing this. So I think that should, I don't want to say alarm people, but light a fire under people like, the help is not coming yet. Like there's no cavalry coming down the way with like, we figured it out. We got the solution. There's no, as far as I know, there's no connection even being made between the pesticides and looking into that. That study isn't even being done to support what's pretty rampant belief in the industry, which is that this is a pesticide driven illness.
Yeah, that's definitely what I heard like in the beginning when we just started hearing about cases of this. People were definitely trying to pin it on the pesticides and saying that people weren't growing their medicine correctly. And then as we've learned more and more about it, and like you said, we've made those correlations, and it doesn't always seem to be true. So now we've moved away from that, which is nice. And now we're at this period of acceptance and education, and now we need more research. And so that's why things like this are so great. And I think you might have talked about this again too, but I just wanted to like clarify it. Why do you think the hot baths and the capsaicin helps with the relieving the symptoms?
So there's a few theories on what's happening here, but we do know that the THC has pretty potent effects on what's happening in the gut, how it's moving, and also where the blood is flowing. So there's a couple ideas of hot baths pulling some of the blood out of the GI tract and into the skin because it warms you up. And the same thing would happen with capsaicin. It would make it red. The other theory, which I'm more in line with, is like this is all connected. Is this TRPV1 is this temperature sensing receptor that you have in your mouth, but also all over your skin, right? This is why, have you ever had essential oils and accidentally got some in your mouth and you're like, ow, it's like almost like burns, like even on your like lips, it'll like burn your lips. And the reason is these interact with TRPs. These are ion channels that are part of our sensing system as humans, plants, and our sensing system. This makes sense, right? But what we see is that sensing system is intricately tied to the endocannabinoid system. So by stimulating that sensing system, by applying topical capsaicin, we absorb some of that and stimulate these TRPs and sort of just like, etch us into balance. Hot temperatures also stimulate those receptors. It's weird, but these sensing receptors can respond to heat or chemicals.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So interesting. You were just such a wealth of knowledge. I love talking to you.
This is one of my favorite topics, so there's that.
Yeah, definitely. And I can tell. I think everybody can tell. Okay, last question. Somebody wants to know what you have coming up. Somebody wants to know if you're going to be at the Cannabis Science Conference in Baltimore, where they can go to the Cannigma and they can see, all the work that you're working on there. But do you have any other appearances or anything where people can follow you and find out more?
Well, I'll be at MJ BizCon, so if you're super keen to meet me at a cannabis event, I will be in Las Vegas in November. I don't have anything lined up. My goal this year was to really get speaking engagements happening, and a couple unfortunate things happened. Got the COVID and missed one, and so I'm looking for speaking engagements. If you are listening and you have a place that you think I should speak at, you let me know, and we'll get it done. I can even talk about cannabinoid hyperemesis if you're interested.
Yeah.
And then somebody had asked me for resources. DM me. These are all my ways to get a hold of me. I would happily share. This is a PDF. So I have all of in the notes sections, some of the good resources that I used. Happy to help share insight if you're looking for more sort of peer-reviewed literature. But I'm not a magician. I will tell you, I go to this website called PubMed, right? And I type in the words Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome, and then I go reading the literature. So, I believe that you're capable of doing that as well. It's pretty easy compared to just saying the word cannabis, because cannabinoid hyperemesis only gets you 100 results as opposed to tens of thousands of things to sift through. So you can find out pretty good that way. But absolutely, if you want my help in that process, you DM me on any one of these channels, and I will get back to you. Well, don't DM me at the Cannigma. That's not me.
Well, this has been so informative. I really appreciate your time and all the effort and work that you did putting this presentation together for us. I've learned a lot. I know everybody's learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Welcome so much. This is what I like to do, and I'm really happy to be doing it here with you, and can't wait for the next one.
Yeah, I can tell that this is what you love to do. Well, thank you again for joining us as a speaker. Thank you to everybody for watching this episode of the Farmacy Cannabis Lecture Series. Thank you to the Cannigma also for being a great source of information for people looking to learn more about cannabis. I hope that we were able to share some information that will help you all become better informed cannabis consumers, and that this information will help you find relief, which I definitely think that it will. So thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at the next episode.
Can't wait. Check it out, everybody. Cannigma.com.
Yes. Thank you.